Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me wherever you are in the world, and I'm sending each and every one of you loads and loads of love, and I truly hope you're doing very well and that you're getting nicely prepared for Christmas because we've only got 2 weeks left. I can't believe how fast this year has gone by, but what a year with that coronavirus. So let's get started with tonight's story, but if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Henry, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1984 when I was 18 years old at the time, and is something that all these years later I am unable to make any sense of at all. And truly I never imagined sharing my story with anyone, but your anonymous forum has given me the opportunity to speak out about the strange anomalies that happened to me while on a camping trip on the Appalachian Trail. I grew up in a small rural quintessential American town with 2 very outdoorsy parents who loved nothing better than to get their hands dirty, and so I literally grew up with a lifestyle of hunting, fishing, boating, skiing, whitewater rafting and mountain climbing. You name it, and I've probably done it. My parents had never intended to have children until much later on in life because they were desirous to go exploring around the entire globe, and they knew having children would hold them back. But when my mother finally discovered that she was pregnant with me, they put those plans on hold and settled down to married life. We lived in a rather small, basic, rudimentary-looking home in a rural neighbourhood where everybody else's houses, quite frankly, put ours to shame. I say that because although our house was a standard Mediterranean design, my parents never bothered about going to those extra lengths to inject that TLC into our home, because as far as they were concerned, our Spartan-looking home served one purpose alone, and it was a roof over our heads, and nothing less and nothing more. All the rustic countrified houses in our neighbourhood were delightfully enchanting, painted in bright, cheerful colours from blues to greens, apricots and yellows, all with wraparound porches and sumptuous entertainment areas, not to mention superbly mowed lawns and well-maintained front and back yards, pristine terraced gardens, and exquisitely colourful seasonal flowers. Our house was the one in the middle of the street that was painted in a very dull blue-grey colour, with a very basic backyard, with a scattering of fruit trees and a bog-standard lawn. The kids in our street called my home the Ugly House, and that name just seemed to stick, like a label on a jam jar that refuses to shift, and I actually never took any offence to it at all. Growing up, I was surrounded by the intricate joys of nature, such as exquisitely mountainous views, rolling hills, silvery lakes, and endless areas of dreamy forest that literally stretched back for miles. I was indeed extraordinarily lucky to live in such a scenic paradise, and I never ever took it for granted. As kids, my friends and I were always on the street. We were riding our bicycles or playing in the woods or swimming in each other's swimming pools during the summer months. The 80s was a fabulous time to be young because it was an easygoing, carefree lifestyle with lots of barbecues, picnics and parties with the best music in the world. Crime was pretty much non-existent in those days. My father worked at the local school as a sports coach, and he was always involved with the Boy Scouts, while my mother busied herself with teaching youngsters how to swim. So as you can see, I came from a very sporty background with a hankering for outdoor pursuits and adventures. When I was 18 years old, I decided to go hiking solo on the Appalachian Trail, as it was something I'd always envisaged doing, and I guess I'd inherited the passion for the great outdoors and for adventure from both my parents. Now I was seemingly old enough, with a plethora of experience behind me, that had well prepared me to camp on my own. My parents were not the slightest bit fazed about my safety, because they knew I was exceedingly proficient in my outdoor skills. My father had invariably taught me everything I needed to know about wilderness survival, from making a fire in a primitive way, to hunting, fishing, and selecting edible roots, fungi and leaves to eat, not to mention the edible insects that are also an excellent source of protein and minerals. My trip began on June the 7th, 1984, and I remember that day as vividly as if it was yesterday. I could feel a burst of adrenaline pulsing through my veins as I set off on my solo, trailblazing adventure, armed with my backpack, tent, sleeping bag, Remington rifle, and everything else I would invariably need for my camping expedition. I felt like an ardent, globe-trotting explorer, and my heart was fluttering like a butterfly with excitement, because the idea of being one with nature warmed the very cockles of my young, exuberant heart, and I couldn't wait for my pilgrimage to begin. Fast forward an entire week, and I was in my element, surviving on my own in the mysterious, enchanting wild terrain, surrounded by mountainous valleys, rugged outcrops, and tall, imposing trees that created vast areas of natural woodland that were so majestic and enchanting. It almost took my breath away. That's how gorgeous it was. I loved the woods with the Spanish moss-covered statuesque trees that created the cooling canopy above my head, where shafts of pretty sunlight would dance on the forest floor in soft dapples of flattering light. Even the fallen tree trunks were covered with green moss, looked like creative, sculptural masterpieces of art, designed by Mother Nature herself. Then there were the elusive indigenous wildlife that was always surprised to see me, and although reserved, reticent and weary, would always regard me with a fervent curiosity, from the gentle doe and her spotted fawn to squirrels darting up and down the trees, the odd chipmunk, and even a lone coyote or two. The bird song in the woods was like an opera of chirps and warbles, and it was all so uplifting and awe-inspiring. There was a stream that meandered and zigzagged through the valley where I would invariably hitch up my tent for the night, and the sound of the gushing current flowing over the pebbly outcrops has got to be one of the most soothing sounds in the entire world, accompanied by the owl hoots and the chorus of crickets, frogs, and the distant sounds of coyotes. I can honestly say that never for a moment did I feel alone in this solitary, vast, impressive, and expansive wilderness. I had been hunting and fishing every single day, camped out in my two-man tent under the silvery stars and the crescent-shaped moon, and I felt more alive and invigorated than in any other time of my life, until some strange, anomalous things began to happen, of which to this day I emphatically believe defy rational explanation. It was on a Tuesday night when I was hitching up my tent in an open clearing, and I was sitting by the fire pit enjoying some freeze-dried macaroni cheese and baked beans, when I suddenly got a very intense, precarious feeling that I was being watched, which left me feeling rather unsettled and apprehensive. I surveyed the area intently, but I could see nothing was there. I sat watching the flames dancing in my fire pit, wondering why I was experiencing this ominous, acrimonious feeling that seemed to cloak my entire being in a dark shroud of uncertainty. It was later that night that I awoke to the sound of rain pelting hard against my tent, so I looked outside only to observe that it wasn't raining at all, and that was when I discovered that the canvas had been stoned with dozens of tiny pebbles. I surreptitiously climbed out of my tent, and using my flashlight I scanned the entire area and was almost sure I'd seen a shadowy dark form running through the woods. My first thought that someone had set up camp close by and was trying to scare me as a practical joke. I wasn't amused in the slightest and felt irritated by such a jubilant prank, but I knew some people took great pleasure in scaring others half to death. I immediately decided to go and find out where these mystery campers had pitched their tent. I remember thinking to myself that two can play at this game, and I would give them a taste of their own medicine by pounding their tent with the very same pebbles that they had used on me. And we would see how they would like that, I thought. I gathered up the fallen pebbles and placed them in a large bag, and off I went searching for the mystery hikers. But I searched, and I couldn't find any sign of them anywhere. I knew someone had been intentionally throwing pebbles at my tent, so I felt very befuddled as to where these strangers were in fact hiding. When I returned to my tent, I could not believe what I was seeing. I thought I was dreaming. My entire tent had been surrounded, and I kid you not, by a perfect circle of the most massive boulders that were so colossal they would have been impossible for a human to manually lift, without using mechanical equipment. In between each boulder was a branch of some sweet-smelling aromatic white flowers that smelt as intoxicating and enchanting as jasmine. Another extraordinary thing was that my backpack had been placed on a high tree branch, and it required a long piece of timber to push it off a suspended elevation so that it landed by my side safely on the ground below. I did not know what on earth was going on. I was muddled, bamboozled, and confused, but suddenly I felt so utterly exhausted that I could barely keep my eyes open. So I reluctantly retreated back to my tent and fell into a very deep, almost trance-like sleep, so overwhelmed by exhaustion that I was just too tired to contemplate the extraordinary things that had just transpired around my camping site. Who on earth had placed those colossal boulders around my tent, I wondered in horror. It was a very peculiar thing to orchestrate, and what on earth did it mean? Or was this all some hilarious joke designed to freak me out purposely, I wondered. The next morning I was shocked to realise that I'd slept until 12 o'clock in the afternoon, which was exceedingly late for me. I suddenly remembered the events of the night before, and to my amazement all the large boulders around my tent had mysteriously been removed, along with the strange flowering branches, but I could see traces of the pretty white blossoms sprinkled on the ground below like confetti. I also understood that my backpack had once again been retrieved, lifted and replaced back on the high tree branch. I'm not easily scared or ruffled up by things, but I knew I had to get to the bottom of this curious, rather baffling mystery, and I was convinced that someone was playing games with me, and certain that it was a couple of campers having a hoot at my expense. But the lengths that they were going to in order to scare me half to death was frankly rather admirable, if not at all very unsettling. That night when I returned to the confines of my snug sleeping bag, I noticed that the canvas was being showered with pebbles again and again, and I looked out of my tent and I could see the dark, shadowy form in the distance that had enticed me to follow him into the woods the previous night. I thought it was a human, disguised in some strange black clothing, designed to look intimidating, who was trying to scare me half to death, and wanted me to follow him, and I was not going running after him at all. This pathetic joke had gone way too far by now, so I decided to remain in my tent. Before long I fell into a deep sleep, and the very next thing I knew was that I was awoken with the feeling of being unable to move. I believe they call it sleep paralysis. It was the most terrifying ordeal that I've ever been through in my entire life, because I was physically incapacitated and unable to move, which was utterly horrifying to me. I was never a believer in the paranormal, so I had no explanation for what I witnessed, but I opened my eyes to see this evil old shrew in a black dress sitting on top of my body and pressing down on my chest with such a brute force I felt like I was being crushed by a slab of concrete. I tried to fight back, but this evil old bag battered the life out of me by bouncing on top of my entire body like a trampoline, and I was unable to fight back because I was so paralysed. Finally she left, and then I came around from the horrific, mystifying experience, second-guessing myself and convincing myself that this had not actually transpired because it was way too bizarre for me to even get my head around. The following day I was almost certain that the decrepit, gnarled old hag and the sleep paralysis must have been a figment of my imagination or a really dreadful dream, but it had felt so incredibly real. But to my horror, when I lifted up my shirt, I had these telltale black bruises all over my torso, and one of them was in the shape of a small human hand. This freaked and discomposed me so much that I decided to hike further along the Appalachian Trail and find somewhere else to camp. I didn't fancy an encounter with a miserable old hag again, nor did I fancy experiencing that peculiar sleep paralysis. I was beginning to think I was going stark raving mad. Maybe it was because I was spending too much time on my own. I found a sublime place to hitch my tent in a remote clearing off the beaten track and close to the silvery, zigzaggy stream that was surrounded with the most unique, interesting-shaped boulders. I prepared my meal that night and gazed up in awe at the magnificent firmament of a glistening full ivory moon and a splattering of silvery stars. I listened to the chorus of crickets and frogs. It was such an enchanting night, and I felt deliriously happy being one with the natural world, and all thoughts of the previous night, bizarre escapades, had all but fleeted from my thoughts. Soon I retired to my comforting sleeping bag, only to find my tent being beaten with showers of tiny pebbles all over again. Oh, no, no, I thought, not again. I felt frustrated that I was being harassed in this way, and I unzipped my tent and looked outside, but there was nothing there. Then I saw him, well, the dark, shadowy form that clearly wanted me to follow him. So I pretended to follow him, as I was certain that this was some weird set-up or childish prank done by one of those hellishly annoying campers that I falsely believed was hounding me with those pathetic pranks. So instead of following the mysterious shadow back into the woods, I retreated sneakily back to my campsite. As I ventured ever closer, I couldn't believe what I was observing, so I took cover behind a large oak tree in close proximity to where my tent was hitched, to have a very good overview. To my absolute horror, I saw these Herculean-sized creatures that were so big, at first glance I actually thought they were bears. But these critters were bigger than bears, and were walking straight up on two legs like human beings. They were like vast towering giants, covered in long, dark, shaggy hair, with overlong arms and cone-shaped heads, with a very distinct gorilla look to their appearance, blended with very clear human-like characteristics. The first thought that came to my mind was that I had to be dreaming, but when I realised I was very much awake, the second perturbed thought to enter my head was, what in God's name are these creatures, and what are they doing? I watched in a stunned, stupefied silence as these incredulous critters lifted massive boulders from around the stream and placed them around my tent in a perfect circle. I promise you they lifted these boulders as effortlessly as feathers, and carried them in their arms like soccer balls, lowering them to the ground with such nimble dexterity. I noticed there were 3 of these creatures working together in haste and constantly looking towards the wood line earnestly, and I realised they were checking to make sure that I had not come back yet. One of the critters had branches of the mysterious white flowering shrub, which they placed around my tent. After the task was finally completed, they made these very peculiar owl calls towards the forest, as if they were communicating with someone, and then I watched them gliding back into the woods. I returned to my tent, feeling very gobsmacked by what I'd just witnessed, and what the heck was going on, I wondered in awe, and who or what were those creatures? I had never observed anything so strange in all my life, and why were they placing boulders around my tent in a semicircle in such a weird kind of ritual? It was all exceedingly odd. As I approached my tent and smelt that aromatic, pungent perfume from those peculiar white flowers, I suddenly became incredibly tired, and I could not keep my eyes open. It was almost as if I was drunk or intoxicated. I fell into a very deep, trance-like sleep, only to awaken later the following morning. The monstrous boulders had been surreptitiously moved away, and the strange white cherry blossoms all but gone. I started to reflect on everything that had transpired, and I couldn't make any sense of it at all. I decided to stay at my camping spot for a whole nother night. Once again my tent was pelted and bombarded with showers of pebbles, but I chose to stay fixed in my tent, and I ignored the thumping commotion. I knew that those creatures wanted to lure me away from my tent, so that they could surround it again with those mysterious boulders, and I didn't want that to happen again. I fell into a deep sleep, and once again I was awoken to the feeling of being completely paralysed and unable to move a single muscle. I looked up to see the evil old batty shrew pressing down on my body with her fists, as if she was kneading a batch of large dough. I was unable to move a muscle, and she began to pound me with such a brute force. It was so agonising. I wanted to scream out in pain, but I was paralysed. She was using even more aggression than she had on the first night that I'd encountered her. This evil, insidious, demonic witch looked like the Grim Reaper. I have no other way to describe her. She seemed to revel in my helpless despair, as I was incapacitated and unable to fight back. It seemed as if she had rammed up the intensity of her attacks, and I truly thought I was going to die that night. I've never felt so helpless, so terrified, and so dreadfully alone in my entire life. The following morning I was horrified to see that my torso was literally covered with black and blue bruises and all the finger marks from that old hag. I was certain this devilish woman was intent on killing me, or finishing me off at least. And it was then that I noticed an extraordinary parallel. Every time the stones were placed around my tent, the hag never bothered me at all. But if they weren't there, she would invariably attack me. I began to realise that those mysterious, hairy creatures in the woods were actually protecting me from the evil old shrew with a strange ritual of theirs. This meant they knew who or what she actually was, and they possibly believed that I was in mortal danger. Suddenly everything made perfect sense to me, but I was exceedingly perplexed as to why these strange, curious-looking, humanoid, hairy creatures were so intent on helping me. They didn't owe me anything. Why did they care about a perfect stranger like myself? The following night, when the creatures pelted my tent with pebbles, I immediately obeyed the ritual and allowed myself to be lured away by the dark shadow, which I suspected was one of those creatures. I returned to find the colossal boulders being placed around my tent, so I slipped into my tent and into my sleeping bag that night, very comfortably, knowing that I was indeed very safe and sound. But I was awoken during the night to a curious hissing sound and a loud, piercing scream. So I unzipped my tent to actually observe the old bag standing outside the stone boulders. She was hissing at me furiously. She appeared to be incensed and incandescent with rage, and was kicking at the boulders violently with her emaciated bony legs. It would seem that she could not cross the threshold to get to me. I remember getting a ghastly feeling that if she had actually succeeded in getting into my tent that very night, I would have not lived to see another day. I really felt certain about that. I watched this witch-like being with my eyes wide open, and I could sense that she was insidiously evil. Suddenly she dissolved before my eyes like a ghost, and was literally gone in a flash of light. The very next day I made a hasty retreat from the Appalachian Trail by setting out at first light and moving like the wind as fast as I could to make my way back to civilization. For many long years after the event, I pondered about what those creatures were that had saved me from the evil old shrew. When I returned home, I did tons of research at the local library, and I discovered that many people from all over the world appeared to have encountered this evil old hag during sleep paralysis, so I wasn't alone with this experience. I do believe she's a demonic entity who has insidious, malevolent intentions. It was only years later, though, that I discovered that those creatures I observed placing boulders around my tent were, in fact, Bigfoot. I think they have an extraordinary ability to tap into the supernatural realm, and they knew what the intentions of that hag were, and they used some kind of outer-worldly ritual to protect me. I believe Bigfoots have the ability to slip in and out of our reality, and I'm certain they understand the paranormal world and how to overcome its negative influences. They know things that, as human beings, we are obliviously ignorant about. I am quite certain that there are others like me who've had similar experiences, especially along the Appalachian Trail, but are way too terrified to share them because, quite frankly, the stories sound so far-fetched and bizarre. In fact, so much so, it's hard to believe that they're real. But I assure you this actually happened to me. And if others out there have had similar experiences, I beg you to have the courage to share your story, so that we can make sense of these curious mysteries that seem to abound along the Appalachian Trail. So there you are. That's my story. I'm also interested about that question, and I also wonder how many people have actually had sleep paralysis. Funny enough, I've only ever experienced it once in my life, and I have also heard it described as the old hag. But I never saw a witch on me, but I do remember being so utterly terrified, and I'm very glad that it only happened to me once, and it was when I was away, and it was in Las Vegas, and I remember feeling so incredibly incapacitated. I just could not move. I couldn't move a single muscle, and I've never been so frightened in my entire life, and I was to found that the place that I was actually staying at, that there were other people in the very room where I'd been sleeping that had also had sleep paralysis in there. So there is a great deal of curiosity about this phenomenon. Until next time, goodbye and good night.